The conversation surrounding race in America is one fueled by emotion, pain, anger, frustration, and sorrow. And as we sit here tonight after nearly 2 weeks of protests, our emotions are raw and inflamed, which makes it hard to understand the path toward healing. This week, I've seen profile pictures change to Black. I've seen many people raise their voices to speak on the topic. I've seen protests around the United States and the world, and I've seen a call for the thin blue line and support for officers. We are all wounded, standing on the opposite sides of the street trying to be heard. Tonight, I want you to see myself and my guest as peacemakers. We are standing in the middle of the street or kneeling in the middle of the street, asking humanity to lay down its weapons and speak to those who are not like us, whom we may not understand, to digest why we are here today and discuss how we can move forward. Our collective emotions have fueled a spark that engulfed us in flames, and it's now up to us to determine how we rise from the ashes. This evening, we have gathered an impressive panel of guests from all different walks of life who will bring their unique experiences and perspectives to this conversation. We have a pastor, a grandchild of a Holocaust survivors, a crisis negotiator, a retired police captain, and a former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney. Most of my guests have been lifelong residents. Many of my guests are career police officers, and every one of my guests this evening is passionate about opening up a conversation on race in America and how we can heal our hearts and move forward together for change. Our conversation tonight comes with a few ground rules. First, we will not tolerate hate speech of any kind, and I mean it. Second, please know that our guests, while all professionals in their respective fields, come to us tonight as human beings. They will offer their opinions through their unique lens of life, taking into account their race, gender, career paths, and their own socioeconomic background, as we all do. Any opinion you hear tonight is offered to further this conversation on how we move forward. I simply ask that you be kind and be respectful. Before we begin and I introduce my guest, I'm going to have a brief word from our sponsor, Arcadia at Limerick Point.
Opening this fall, Arcadia at Limerick Point will be the premier destinations for seniors in Montgomery County. Offering independent living, supportive personal care, and the Compass Memory Care, Arcadia is here to give you the retirement and lifestyle you deserve. At Arcadia, you'll find yourself in a worry-free retirement filled with choices, wellness opportunities, friendships, an inclusive faith-based approach, and unparalleled services and amenities. Be among the first to discover all that Arcadia has to offer and reserve your apartment today.
Welcome back. Let me first introduce Representative Dan Williams of the 74th District in the upper right-hand corner. Representative Williams was born and raised in West Philadelphia and has been a resident of Chester County for 40 years. He is a pastor at New Life in Christ Fellowship Church in Coatesville and was elected to the House of Representatives in November 2018. Welcome, Representative, and thank you for joining us.
Brooke, thank you for having me, and thank you for the conversation that we get to have, specifically because we're addressing a difficult issue through the lens of heat, through the lens of light, rather than heat. Information, not emotion. You're right. I have the privilege of serving as a pastor of more than 30 years at New Life in Christ Fellowship, located in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. And I have the honor of representing the 74th District in Chester County. And so it's a real joy to be with you tonight.
We are thankful to have your voice. Next, in the upper left corner, we introduce Deb Ryan, the District Attorney of Chester County. Deb is the first woman to be elected District Attorney of Chester County after spending over 15 years of her career in Philadelphia and Chester counties as an assistant DA, where she handled thousands of high-level criminal cases, including homicides, domestic abuse, child abuse, and gun violence. Welcome, Deb. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Brooke.
Next, I would like to introduce Steve Jarmon. He's in the bottom right-hand corner for all of those here. He is a partner at the firm of Lamb McErlane in Westchester. Steve is a former prosecutor working alongside Deb Ryan in the DA's office prior to entering the field of criminal defense. Steve is also an elected committee person for the Chester County Democratic Committee and active in local elections. Steve, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Brooke. I appreciate you putting this show together. I think it's an important show, and I'm looking forward to participating in this discussion.
Thank you so much. Next, bottom left, we have Sergeant Christine CUSICK, a 24-year police veteran who currently runs the Criminal Investigation Division at her agency. Prior to her current position, Christine was a field training officer and a member of the County Emergency Response Team as a crisis negotiator. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you so much for having me, Brooke.
Sorry, I should be calling you Sergeant CUSICK. You earned that title.
Christine is fine.
Next, let me introduce in the bottom middle here, we have retired Police Captain Brandon RHONE. Prior to his retirement, Brandon ran the day-to-day operation of his agency. He is an expert in the training of law enforcement and is a certified instructor in the areas of law enforcement intelligence, defense tactics, interview and interrogation, and use of force. Welcome, Captain RHONE.
Evening, thanks for having me.
All right, guys, let's get right to this discussion. I know we've got a lot of people listening. I'm going to start first with Representative Williams here. Hours ago, you and your peers from the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus took to the floor of the House and took a stand to demand action to address systematic racism and bring awareness to Black Lives Matter movement. Tell me how today went and how your office and the caucus is attempting to address reform through legislation.
Brooke, today started out with a lot of uncertainty in terms of how this sort of demonstration of civil disobedience might appear, but the motivation was certainly passionate and directed. One of the concerns that members of the Black Legislative Caucus shared was the way in which potential legislation had not been brought to the floor that could in many ways mitigate some of the issues that the country and our communities are now very passionate about regarding police. And so this was an opportunity to move forward the discussion to get some of those bills that might be impactful on the issues of violence, on the issues of unarmed Black men dying while in police custody. These were bills that we believe could work in ways to help better move forward, not only the conversation, but to preserve the lives of those who have obviously been dying across the countryside for a number of years. And so there were issues that were being addressed, like better access to videos. How do we now think through police officers who leave one precinct or one district and make their ways to other districts with a history of violent behavior or disciplines? How do we work at trying to create a database to make sure that these individuals don't get to transition without knowledge of what their past might be like? In addition to that, there was this idea of thinking, how do we work towards better evaluations in maybe 3 to 5 years of the impact of post-traumatic stress disorders? When you think of what many of our law enforcement officers have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, adding to the fact that some of them have military backgrounds, it would just make good sense to do an evaluation periodically to see how they're doing and hopefully sort of mitigate some of the issues that confront our communities. So in large part, that's what today was about, to move forward the agenda that allows particular bills to come to the floor for consideration that could actually help save lives and make the Commonwealth a better place.
It looked like you brought a good representation to the floor today, and I hope that that was able to move some reform forward. You know, one of the things that we're going to talk about today, obviously, you brought up the issue, is there is a inherent tension between the Black Lives Matter movement and the Thin Blue Line, which is why I'm so happy to have Sergeant CUSICK and Captain RHONE with us as members of the law enforcement agency, as well as District Attorney Deb Ryan, who is the queen of all law enforcement in the county, let's put it that way. So it's going to take everybody at every level to open this conversation and have this discussion. So let me move over to the District Attorney. You know, as Representative Williams has said, there has been a call to law enforcement to affect change in the operations. You, as being the head of all law enforcement in Chester County, can you tell me from a district attorney what sort of things you can do to implement criminal justice reform to prevent the abuse of power by law enforcement?
We have an overwhelming responsibility to make sure we stand up against racism and against police brutality. This is an opportunity where all district attorneys' offices should do some internal reflection and see where can we make some positive change as a result of what's going on. None of us, or I certainly haven't seen anything like this movement in my lifetime. And so I know that we can channel some of this into some good to implement criminal justice reform, which has always been something that we were interested in doing. So now our goal is to make sure we're taking a good hard look at what we're doing internally to ensure that there is equality and justice for all people of all kinds. And that means making sure that we are, one, hiring an office that is reflective of the community. Diversity in our office is really an important thing that we're working on. The other thing is making sure that we're giving training to the people who work there to ensure that we have parity among all different types of people with respect to bail, sentencing, and every single step of the way regarding a criminal justice measure. So making sure that we're implementing policies and protocols where we look at implicit bias training, cultural diversity training, where we can focus on how we fight against prejudice and bias, whether it's intentional or not. These are things that we definitely need to implement internally. We started a racial and ethnic diversity work group in the office where we're going to be focusing on how we can implement change within. And a lot of that has to do with reviewing the data and looking at these numbers to see why is there such a disparity with respect to how we treat minorities. Once we can accomplish that, we need to then figure out what is the protocol in place that's necessary to make sure that we can treat everyone fairly and equally. So we have some serious soul searching to do. And a lot of that has to do with looking at how we can ensure that equality is served among all people. Accountability is incredibly important. We know that we may have some police officers who do not want to be stepping up and going into court in cases. We know that there needs to be more transparency with respect to hiring procedures and protocols, which is why red flag reforms are so important. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but making sure that we're hiring people who have integrity and good character. The good news is that I've worked with law enforcement for more than 15 years. And in Chester County, I can tell you with an overwhelming majority of good people who serve on the force, their job is to protect and serve us. And I have seen some of the finest people do those things who are protecting our children, our family members, our loved ones, our neighbors. So we know that there are so many good police officers out there who do their job, but making sure that we're also reviewing protocols in law enforcement with respect to excessive force, de-escalation training, dealing with the mentally ill, hate crimes, internal affairs investigations. There's a whole host of things that we really need to take a deep, hard look at, but I think it's possible. And getting out and engaging with the community is one of the steps that we can take to make sure that we're listening to the community and hearing what they have to say, take into consideration what their feelings are and their opinions, and seeing how we can move things forward.
Yeah, I mean, we will talk about the red flag reforms a little bit later in the show, but I mean, what you're discussing is one of the things is opening up those communications within your office and within your force. And I think one of the things that we should do is open up these conversations, which are hard to handle. And I know, I'm sure you've had the same experience. You know, I have friends in law enforcement, and I've been actively supporting Black Lives Matter movement. And I think people see them as one side or the other. And I'm happy to have our police officers here to talk to that. I think we all here understand that it's not one side or the other. We have to talk about this on a global level in order for us to have the conversations that need to move us forward. So I'm going to turn over to Sergeant CUSICK. I want to talk about the thin blue line. So the thin blue line is a well-known term for police that is used to assert that they are the line that keeps society from descending into violent chaos. Found that on Wikipedia. That's my source. As a member of law enforcement, can you please tell us, and a 24-year veteran of law enforcement, can you please tell me what your thoughts are on the thin blue line mentality?
So what the thin blue line mentality or structure means to me is just that. It's a support structure. It's a community of law enforcement officers who take pride in what we do. And there are a lot of us that are very good, and we were called to this profession, and there are things that we see or experience or do every day that the normal citizen wouldn't be able to understand. And so I think it is important that we have that group to associate with amongst ourselves, so that we do get that sense of empathy and support and appreciation from our peers. So it's really no different than any other group that would express pride in their profession or their background or their demographic or what have you. The problem that, or I don't want to call it a problem, but the issue that I kind of see with the thin blue line with this most recent issue, this most recent thing that's come up, is I think that some members in our community have kind of adopted the, you have to pick a side. And so, of course, we're going to pick our side. We're going to pick our profession. But one of the things that I think is important that we remember is that, we all chose this profession, and we all took an oath to protect and serve the community. And when we did that, we weren't taking an oath to the thin blue line. We were taking an oath to our community. And so that's who we're really accountable to. And I think that when we engage in supporting the thin blue line very openly, sometimes members of the community can view that in a different way, and think that it means just that we're against those other beliefs or those other movements. And I think that that's the wrong message to send. I would like to believe that most of our officers, and I do believe that most of our officers are like this. Ms. Ryan already touched on this. She knows the police officers in Chester County, and the professionalism in this county is outstanding. There are a few bad apples, yes. And I think that most of us on the thin blue line, we don't want to associate with those people. But I think it's also important that we don't alienate ourselves by making it about us. Like, well, what about us? What about what's happening to us? There's people that are assaulting us, and there's people that aren't appreciating us. I think we kind of need to, as a group, step back and understand what our oath was about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and listen, that's a tough thing to say as a member of the thin blue line, so thank you for your courage in saying that. But I think these uncomfortable conversations are what we all have to have right now in order to better understand things that are outside of us. Captain RHONE, I'm going to ask you the same question about the thin blue line movement. What do you think about Christine's comments, and do you have anything to add to that?
I 100% agree. I think the biggest issue we face is you have to be on one camp or the other. And that's really not, as Sergeant CUSICK said, that's really not what the thin blue line is about. It's having that group of people who understand the things that you've gone through in the course of that shift or that month or whatever case may be. And you can have some very candid conversations about what you've experienced on the job. Because, the flip side of that coin is that you need to have those conversations for your own mental health, right? You need to talk about if you've dealt with a child abuse case or a fatal car accident or whatever it is that you went through in the course of your duties. You need to be able to go and have a conversation with somebody who understands. Sure, you can go talk to somebody else, but they don't really understand the the dynamics of what you went through. So, the thin blue line was really, that's what it was about, right? Being able to lean on the shoulder of somebody who has a very similar experience and maybe help you through that process, right? And talk about it and work through that. And somewhere along the way, and I'm not really sure where, it became a them versus us, and that's really not what it is.
I mean, Representative Williams talked on there was some legislation about PTSD in officers and helping, I would presume, with mental health of officers, because we have to acknowledge the job that you do as officers is a job that you are a special group of individuals to take on the responsibility and to take on that task. But as they say, with great power comes great responsibility, and weighing all those balances has to be extremely difficult. I want to go back to a conversation about changing policies, and District Attorney Ryan, she raised the issue of red flag reforms. So for anyone who has been paying along, just this past week, top police executives in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, including leaders of police unions in Philadelphia and the State Fraternal Order of Police, along with the Pennsylvania District Attorneys Association, signed a statement of support. So it's not legislation yet, but is a statement of support to red flag reforms, which are legislative changes in the hiring process of law enforcement. A joint statement reads as follows, that was released, says officers who engage in misconduct or use excessive force erode trust in law enforcement and make it harder for our communities to be and feel safe. When they leave an agency or retire in lieu of termination, their record needs to go with them. We stand united in calling for reform of the hiring process so that law enforcement agencies have the information to make informed decisions about the personnel they hire. Does any one of my guests and panelists want to talk about the red flag reforms? District Attorney, you raised this up, and I know you're a member of the District Attorney's organization. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
I think these are essential. We need to know who we're looking at when we vet law enforcement to ensure that we are only hiring the best, because these people do have a lot of responsibility, and the abuse of power and the potential for that is so great that we need to do everything in our power to vet them and make sure that we do thorough background checks. And the idea that so many different organizations are supporting this reform is really notable, because for a very long time, people were not endorsing these transparent types of background checks, and we never understood why. And for us to work together and gain the trust of the community again, it means that we have to do a thorough vetting of people who want to engage in this type of career path, because it's an important and awe-inspiring type of job to have with a lot of power. And so if we don't make sure that we're hiring the right people who have integrity, who have good character, how can we gain the trust of the public? And I think this is what this type of reform is going to do.
Absolutely. Sergeant CUSICK and Captain RHONE, you both are, as career police officers, have trained officers on your own. And I know we've had discussions off air about the hiring process. Sergeant CUSICK, do you want to give maybe the public a little insight about the hiring process and how it is sometimes hard to see a individual officer's background?
Well, the hiring process it varies from agency to agency. Some people send themselves through police academy if they're looking for a path in municipal policing, or they can apply to an agency and that agency will send them to their own academy. I've been involved in conducting background checks for years with my own agency, and I've also been involved in the hiring process at my agency. And one of the things that I find a little bit disappointing is when I started in police work over 20 years ago, it was a fairly well sought after career. And there would be many candidates for maybe one or two positions. Now we're lucky if we get 30 to 40 candidates showing up for a testing process. And when I look out amongst those candidates for hire, there are very few faces of color. There are very few people like me, females, that are applying. And I think that our key is, and we had talked about this before, is in the recruitment, so that we do have police agencies that are more representative of the communities that we are serving. Now, therein lies the rub, is how do we get these people to be interested in a career in policing, especially when we have these issues coming up and they may not feel inclined to join an organization such as a police department with what's going on now. In the background checks, I feel that my agency does a very good job vetting out people's backgrounds. And I would like to think that a lot of agencies put just as much work into doing those backgrounds, but yet we see people hopping around from agency to agency or applying, at a multitude of agencies that somehow are slipping through the cracks. And so thorough background checks hopefully will prevent that. And then the other issue I see is just with retaining officers. Like, are we retaining the best officers that we can keep on the force?
Part of this, like as you touched upon, is we have to start rebuilding the trust within the communities in order to make sure that the recruiting process does reflect the communities that we all live in. Captain RHONE, what are your thoughts on hiring and retention of officers? And essentially, I'm going to go over to Representative Williams after about. I want to know how we can start rebuilding the trust to start opening up, our police departments to more reflect the society in which we all live. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'll work backwards from your questions. I think one of the areas where we kind of went astray in law enforcement was we made community policing a special unit, right? And that's really, community policing is every officer's job out there on the road. And it's not really a special unit of officers whose job is to go engage the community. One of the things that I really appreciated was being able to pull up on a corner and jump into a pickup game of basketball or a game of football, and really have that in community engagement. And I wasn't a part of the CPU unit, right? Who just handled those type of events. And so we have to get back to the fundamentals of community policing, and it's not just a group of officers that do that. It's every officer that hops in that car and goes out into that community and patrols those streets. So that's one area where I think as a organization or as a profession, we can do a lot better is make community policing every patrol officer's responsibility, not just specialized units. And moving on, talking about hiring, in an effort to not be redundant, we have to make the job attractive again. And I believe we've lost that. The profession of law enforcement is no longer attractive. And so we're finding, as Christine just told us, we're finding less and less people who are interested in doing this job. And at some point, we have to turn that tide back to this being that truly noble profession that people want to get in. When I first came into the job, there was hundreds of people applying, taking the test. You would show up to a test, and that test would run 5-6 hours because the amount of people that had to get through the testing process. And that's just not the case anymore. And I think, we have to, when we talk about that vetting, that background check is, again, being very thorough and getting to really, does this person possess the characteristics that this department wants, that this department needs, right? Because we need to model that behavior. And if we allow folks to slip through the cracks, then we're not modeling the behavior, regardless of what our mission statement says, regardless of what the side of our cars say. We're not modeling that behavior. And so it's important that we have to do that. And attracting those people to do that is difficult. And once we get them in, we have to, if they don't have all the skill sets, which, you know, nobody really does coming out of the academy. You know, I look at the academy as a quick reference, guys, to thumb through the crimes code. But when we get out and we get with that field training officer, that's really the individual that's going to show you the ropes. And that's the individual that, if you're coming in with horrible intentions, your field training officer could really make or break you. And if we have really good field training officers, we tend to weed those people out faster, because that field training officer is going to go back to a supervisor and say, hey, we either need to extend this officer's probation or we need to cut them loose. They're not going to make the cut. And we need to have those courageous conversations to, if we can coach somebody through and get them to where they need to be, great. And if they can't, then we need to move them along. And moving them along doesn't mean moving the problem from my agency to the next door agency. They don't belong in the profession. We have to change the behavior, not relocate the person who's misbehaving, because we're moving the problem from one place to another, and we've never addressed the behavior.
I mean, I think the red flag reforms that were discussed, I know reviewing them earlier today, it talks about maybe having body cam video footage open and accessible to the public through a right to know request, which seems very powerful. You know, having a database where any of the complaints against officers could be placed, because I know that there are some instances where non-disclosure agreements are drafted. And so, you know, when you are a hiring agency, you have to be able to have all of the background and information in order to make those best decisions. So you touched, you know, you're both, all of you are talking about training of the individuals in power. You know, the district attorney said that about training within her office and making sure that it's throughout the county of Chester within the individual agencies. Steve, I will get to you in a moment, but I want to flip over to Rep. Williams one more time. How do we start to rebuild the trust of the community and bridge that back together with law enforcement?
Brooke, this is a tough task, but it's noble and it's worthy. I'll simply sort of embrace everything that's been said, but add, and this is an example, something to think about. Camden, New Jersey was once the murder capital, and Camden was able to rebuild their police force. And one of the ways they were able to do that and change some of what's taking place there, at least now, is there was a reprioritization of funds in terms of how they spent in the whole area of law enforcement and policing. But then secondly, they were able for years to make healthy deposits relationally into the residents. And so what you had there was a kind of relational reform where law enforcement officers, some of whom were a part of that community, some who were not, but spent time developing relationships with that community, were able to find ways to work in harmony, build trust, reform the department, and now has become a model, I think, for others to follow. When you and I are talking about the issues between law enforcement and specifically African-American people with the underlying factor of racism, it is not nearly as simple as body cameras. There is a pathology that's taking place. When I talk to men and women who look like me, almost invariably, everyone has a negative story of an interaction with a police officer. That's not just a matter of a few bad apples. There is something about that systemically that needs to be uprooted and transformed through some of the things we're discussing tonight on this call.
Yeah, you know, it's almost so overwhelming that it's so hard to understand where to begin, because it seems like it's permeating from every institution within the United States. And to that, I'm going to turn over to Mr. Jarmon. So I was recently viewing some stats about the racial breakdown of people who control our institutions. So these numbers were from 2016 to 2017, and I found this to be pretty staggering. US Congress is 90% white. US governors, 96% white. Top military advisors, 100% white. President and vice president, 100% white. US Freedom Caucus, 99% white. People who decide what books we read, 90% white. Teachers, 82% white. Full-time college professors, 84% white. You know, these numbers show me that the change has to be everywhere. Obviously, our United States does not reflect those numbers. And, you know, as a member involved in our community with local elections, what do you think, you know, let's discuss the importance of voting and what voting could do to sort of assist this, you know, assist the control of our institutions.
I think, excuse me, I think voting is definitely important. I mean, right now we're in a state where we've seen protests day after day. So what the protest does is get the national attention. So now that there's attention, what did we do from there? If this whole situation ended with, you know, protests and nothing happened, then it would have been a waste of effort. Pretty much everyone who is in position to make a decision on your life can either be voted in or out of office. And I think it's important for the people to understand that. Every person that that makes a decision in your life can be voted in or out of office in some way. And when I think about this, I think about what happened in Ferguson a few years back with the shooting of Michael Brown, who was unarmed. At that time, you had a prosecutor who did not bring charges. He refused to bring charges. There were protests. It made national news. But the story didn't end there. Obviously, the officer never was arrested by that under that administration. So what happened next was, I feel, what is the necessary next step in a process like this. The prosecutor who refused to bring charges had been in that office for 27 years. Deb, hopefully you can make it that long. But he'd been in office for 27 years and basically had been unchallenged. Because of the protests and because of the national attention that was brought to that protest, the people in that community were engaged, probably for the first time in a local election. A lot of us, you know, myself included, in the past, I would go vote in the national election, call it a day. I think I did my civic duty, not realizing that local politics, the people who are in local position, really have more of an effect on your day-to-day life than national politicians do. So the people were engaged, and a few years after that prosecutor refused to make an arrest, he was voted out of office for the first time in 27 years. Someone from city council said, you know what? I'm going to run. I'm going to take this momentum of people wanting change. And he ran on that. He ran on, I will bring the change. And people were responsive to it. And so what you had was a situation where people who probably hadn't voted in local elections ever came out in droves and changed. They created the change they wanted to see. Just last week, for the first time in Ferguson, an African-American was voted mayor. So that's what you can see when you follow up protests with action. So it takes Representative Williams doing what he's doing. So he's seeing the protest, attention is brought to it. He now goes to Harrisburg as our representative, and now he has momentum. You know, he stands there confident, knowing that the people are behind him and want to see change. So he's not going to face as much resistance as he would before, knowing that there's people protesting and marching with him.
Right. And I think I too kind of got involved locally, and it is amazing once you start paying attention to where change does start. And I say that it starts top down. We have to work on that, but it definitely starts street level. I mean, the people who make decisions about what roads are going to be open are the people within your town who are representatives to the borough council. Captain RHONE and Sergeant CUSICK, you know, we've talked about this before, you know, when we were doing prep, but the individuals who elect the chief are the mayor, who's an elected official, and borough council or a board of supervisors, who are all elected officials within their community and serve within, you know, within their streets. So it is important, clearly, that we have to take this momentum and think about who represents us, because we do set forth those laws. I mean, we are, you know, District Attorney Ryan was elected in, and she in her office is implementing strategies in order to make sure that those who are prosecuting crimes are also reflective of the community in which they serve. This goes to show we just need more conversation. Has there, and anybody can answer this, has there been any, are there any local forums for police officers to speak to the communities which they represent? You know, Captain RHONE, you stressed this. Deb, are there any local forums to do that right now to further these conversations?
So we are having a meeting tomorrow with the president of the FOP and the president of the Chief of Police Association, along with Kyle Boyer from the NAACP Westchester chapter, talking about how we're going to move forward, what kind of dialogues we need to engage in, and how is the best way to do this. We also met with the commissioners today and other elected officials, trying to gauge exactly how to navigate this in a way where we're not just engaging in dialogue, which is incredibly important, and having that honest dialogue, but really taking actionable items and doing something with it. So our hope and expectation is that we will be hosting these town halls or going out into the communities all over the county, where we start the conversation, but then really do something with it, because we're done talking. You know, we want to hear what people have to say, but we also know that if we don't take measures to implement change, nothing's going to be different. So I think we have a lot of very vested people who are open-minded to change, and that includes law enforcement. So I'm very optimistic and hopeful that we can do something, harness this energy now in a positive way moving forward.
Yeah, conversations with the community is going to be where it starts. Representative Williams, you know, you've been a pastor within your community for, I think, 25 years. You know, from your perspective as a pastor, what sort of role do you think that church is going to play in this movement?
Well, one of the things that we've done in the past is open the church as a space to allow for the kind of forums that you're describing and that Judge Ryan just articulated. So this becomes a space where a forum is made possible that in many ways allows suffering to speak. People get to sort of talk about the issues they have. Law enforcement involves themselves in an exchange, a dialogue that we've seen take place in the 74th, right there at the church I pastor. And we've seen it work very, very well. But I do agree with Deb that at some point we have to move beyond the dialogue. We also have to move beyond protest and talk about process, which is how people at the local level begin to engage in all of these systems that can help to end this scourge of racism. In fact, one of the great things about the Black Lives Matters movement is that it's grassroots and it's bottom up. Too much of what we've done to approach this issue in our country has been top down, and that won't work. So right now you're starting to see what might be a new civil rights movement that allows the engagement of people of faith, just like the original civil rights movement that was formed primarily out of the church. So men and women like Walt Fauntleroy, King, Abernathy, even before that, Howard Thurman. These were people of faith, in many cases ministers, who understood that when we were talking about the issues of violence or police brutality or racism, these were not in and of themselves political issues. They were moral issues. They were human rights issues. And so this active involvement of the faith community in moving in these areas, I think historically has proven to be a great assimilation and to have served the Commonwealth and the common good well.
Absolutely. I mean, you're very right. The conversation has to change into movements. And now I'm going to get into a little bit of a hot button topic that has also sort of permeated our airwaves recently. And I'm going to ask the questions of everybody, but particularly my police officers here. On Sunday, the Minneapolis City Council announced they intend to defund and dismantle the city's police department following the police killing of George Floyd and replace it with a transformative new model of public safety. It appears that the definition of defend is existing on a sliding scale. It ranges essentially from completely dissolving and divesting funds, completely dissolving the police force, to basically divesting funds to different social services. But no matter what, the defund the police is a topic that looks at how we're going to reimagine public safety moving forward. So I'm going to leave it up to both of you. Just raise your hand who's going to go first. What are your initial impressions on the defund the police topic?
I'll jump out there.
Sergeant Cusick.
Brandon wasn't going to raise his hand first, so I guess I'll jump I don't really like the idea of defunding. From the most extreme portion of it would be abolishing police agencies altogether. And that's an awful idea. That's just a terrible idea. I don't think anybody wants to live in a society where they can't feel safe in their own homes. Not everybody is willing to protect themselves or able to protect themselves, and they need police for that. So I think I don't want to waste a whole lot of time on that. I just think that abolishing police altogether is just not a good idea at all. Defunding, I understand the concept of it, and as I understand it, what they're trying to do is take money away from the police agencies and then allocate those funds to other services that police may do. And that really isn't our function to do, whether that is intervening in mental health crisis or drug abuse crisis, and a lot of things of those nature. You know, we as police officers, we're essentially social service officers. I would say that a good portion of my job, although it is responding to crimes, investigating crimes, but I speak as when I was a patrol officer, was responding to stuff that is not necessarily crimes. There are issues that need to be addressed because of somebody's in mental health crisis, or there's a child that doesn't want to go to school, or my girlfriend just did something today, and we got called to this all the time. Bats in your house. People call the police when they don't have anyone else to call. And so they're having a problem at that moment and they need our help. And so I think, although the idea to allocate those funds other places is not necessarily a bad idea, and I don't disagree with it, I can see some issues with it too. I know that some police departments, they're having problems staffing officers. They can't get to crimes in a timely manner because their staffing levels are so low. And so the reason for that is they don't have enough money coming into the police department to hire more officers. And so then you have this situation where you kind of needed officers, but we don't have any money for them. So I don't know what the answer is to the defunding question. I understand what, I guess, the premise is behind it, but I don't think it's necessarily a great idea.
Captain RHONE?
Sure, absolutely. I agree with everything Sergeant CUSICK just said, I believe that there are definitely resources that are necessary in every community. Mental health is kind of the hot topic, but if and those professionals need to increase their numbers to be able to handle those caseloads. But if we decrease funding to law enforcement, then how do we adequately train and equip folks to do the job if we don't have the funds to pay for that? So how do we get to a position, we kind of get to this point of, at some point, if that's going to be, it's going to be which one is the lesser of the two evils. And talking about, that training aspect, that money's got to come from somewhere. And so if that's now taken out of the budget, we run into the same issue of how do we get an officer to the point of which he or she can continue to work here and do the job and model the behavior that we want them to model. And so if we start pulling those funds and doing so, and again, I don't disagree that those other resources within communities need funds. Again, it's kind of like the Black Lives Matter and the thin blue line. We're kind of at a point where now it's one or the other, but why can't it be both? Why can't we have an understanding that the mental health professionals and other resources are needed in our community, and resources are also needed within our law enforcement? And we're really on the cusp of the edge of that divide again, right? It's either police or not police and something else. And we're going to back ourselves into a corner that I don't think really will become very beneficial to our communities. But we need to find a way to bridge that gap and work together with our law enforcement, our community leaders, our other outside agencies, and those resources that will help the community as a whole. We can't split down the middle.
Christine, quickly, and then I'm going to flip over to my attorneys on the panel to talk about court.
Yeah, just one thing that I wanted to add to what Brandon said. Yeah, when we're taking money from agencies, this kind of brings us back right into the recruiting of police officers and how we're not getting quality candidates to apply for police positions. So if we defund and we take out money out of the coffers for our police agencies. Look, none of us got into this job to become rich. I certainly am not. However, if we're saying to somebody, hey, look, we want you to come work for us, and we're going to expect you to deal with all of this with very limited resources. Maybe we'll give you some equipment that's subpar, and here, we're going to pay you pennies. That's not going to do much for our recruitment either. So I think it could be counterproductive to bringing in those qualified individuals that we're looking for.
So let me play devil's advocate for a second from the redirection to social services, because as attorneys, I know the district attorney and Mr. Jarmon, there have been programs within the county, mental health court, veterans court, drug court. So in your experience within the county over, the 15 years that you both have been practicing, and Steve, as a defense attorney, what do you think that those courts that turn sort of punishment into rehabilitation, how do you personally feel about those programs?
I think they're excellent programs. I mean, in my experience, both as a prosecutor and defense attorney, it's rare that I meet somebody that's a bad person. Usually I'm meeting someone who made, a bad decision, and it could be a very bad decision that can affect the rest of their life. But, on average, the people I'm interacting with are good people. We're friends with them. We're family members of people that are committing crimes or find themselves in that situation. So I love the benefit that is provided by Deb Ryan's DA's office, other DA's office in the area, where you can maybe avoid a potential criminal record and not be able to get a job in the future for a one-time bad decision. So I definitely don't want to see any funding go away from that. In fact, I think if anything, that should be increased. But I don't think it should come at the expense of taking away money from the police. I agree with Brandon and Christine. You know, the reason why we're here, the reason why I believe we're having this discussion tonight is because a bad person was able to get into a good profession and do a very bad thing. So the solution for me is, how do we avoid that? And we've talked about that tonight, you know, and Christine hit it right on the money, which is, you know, how do we get those people to want to come, so that people making those decisions on who to hire have a bigger pool to select from. It's almost like a jury trial when we go to trial. Like, you know, if there's only 20 people there to choose from, then, you know, we kind of take what we can get. But if there's 50, 60, 100, you know, you have a better chance of, you know, getting the jury that you may want. Same thing with a job. So I would want to see incentives for police officers to, that police officers or people aren't choosing to do that profession because it is a noble profession. I recognize that, even though I'm a defense attorney and make my living going up against them in court every day. But it's a noble profession. And I think that, you know, we have a history in this country of not valuing the people that do the most valuable things. So we don't pay teachers well. You know, we don't incentivize police officers very well, but, you know, we need them to do their job. We need them to do their job very well. I've always said that to be a police officer, not everybody can do that job. I know I couldn't. You have to be exceptional to do the job. And so what you want is to attract people that are exceptional to the position. And taking away money, making it so people can't hire more people or hire the very best, then I think we're, you know, really shooting ourselves in the foot there.
Mm-hmm. District Attorney Ryan, what do you think about sort of the defunding the police movement? And speak only if you feel like you have enough information to talk about it. But I know from your experience as a prosecutor, you know, there are alternatives within the court system to help in a social services way, to help with drugs, to help with anger management, you know, and those, do you feel in your, you know, two questions, one about defunding, and two, do you feel in your experience that those courts have been instituted and have good outcomes with recidivism rate, things like that?
So I agree with what Captain RHONE and Sergeant CUSICK have said, and Steve as well. Defunding the police will only set us backwards, in my opinion. We unfortunately are dealing with the national narrative of the most egregious and unconscionable behavior that we have seen over the past week or so, and then other instances of bad police doing horrific things. And we're forgetting about the heroes that I work with every day and actually see them going in to risk their lives to protect us and save our children and our vulnerable and protect us. And that takes a special kind of person to do that job too. And without them, we're going to have children who are suffering in silence. You know, our child abuse victims are not going to be protected. You know, Sergeant CUSICK is one of our biggest advocates for our children in this county. And without her being able to go in there, have the training that she needs to know how to talk to these kids and make sure that these people are brought to justice, we're doing a huge disservice to the vulnerable populations in our county. So I don't want to overlook the idea that most of these men and women are gravitating toward these jobs because they have a higher calling to actually do good in the world. And I think that's lost in this narrative, unfortunately, because we're dealing with so many overwhelming issues, and racism is the biggest one of all. But with respect to the progress we've made regarding treatment courts and the expansion of programs, we can only expand those programs because rehabilitation for many people is what they need, that opportunity to make change, the services that they need. These are not mutually exclusive ideas where we can still give law enforcement the money that they need to do the job the best they can, and also to fund treatment courts and mental health court and veterans court and the like. These are all important programs. And I think that we do a huge disservice if we neglect any of them. So in my opinion, we need to expand training. We need to expand these programs, give people second chances, but also make sure that we are protecting and serving, which is what law enforcement is here to do.
So And obviously, and I think, like you said, we do have to state that, this is a higher calling for a lot of our police officers to go out and defend and protect. So I guess one of the biggest questions that all of us have, and I'm not sure we can answer it yet, but how do we bridge the gap between these two movements? And, there's obviously reform that has to take place in police departments, but how do we bridge the gap? How can we meet in the middle? Does anybody want to speak to that? What are your ideas about how we can improve relations and, retain good police officers?
I think one of the things we have to do is the good cops, which is like anything. We spend 90% of our time dealing with 10% of the population, and so we're talking about a number of bad cops who should have never been allowed to continue to stay in the position they're in. And I think what law enforcement is going to have to do is, again, get back into that community policing. That thing that Pastor Dan talked about. When I loved being a school resource officer because I was able to be in schools and have great relationships with young folks to help them understand that, yeah, maybe there was a police officer at their house last night and mom or dad was arrested, or there was some unfortunate experience that they had, but they knew that they can come in the next day and we would be able to have a conversation about it. And that, let me talk to you. Tell me what happened and let's talk through this. And we have to do a better job in the profession of really garnishing those relationships. And I think once we do that, then the walls will start to come down and people will start to trust the person behind the badge and the blue or brown or gray or whatever color shirt it is. And that's where we will see the greatest victory, for lack of a better term. Once there's an understanding that I can trust Brandon the person. What I do professionally is I wear that uniform, but as a human being, and we have to get back to that point. I think that's going to be the groundwork to bridging those gaps.
Mm-hmm. Deb, I saw you raise your hand.
Just to add what Brandon has said, I mean, the community policing thing is phenomenal. The idea that we humanize one another, get to know one another, and break down those barriers to learn that we're just all people and we're all trying to do our best. That for me is one of the key antidotes to what we're dealing with now, is that we look at people as just police, or we look at people as just criminals, and we don't humanize the elements. And once we get to know one another, I think that we can break through a lot of barriers and understand we're all just people. We're all trying our best, and there are a lot of good people out there. So I want to hopefully leave on an optimistic note too, that I think that engaging these dialogues and getting to know one another and what we stand for, and that a lot of us are good with good intentions and want to make change and want to work well with one another and respect each other. Those people are out there, and we can work together to make that change.
We're going to move to questions from our viewers. So those who are watching, if you want to ask any questions of these individuals, please make sure that you comment. And they are being posted in the studio. I can see them up here. Rep. Williams, did you want to add to the last conversation before I head over to the questions from our viewers?
I don't. I think pretty much I would simply just agree with so much of what has been said. I don't think I have anything constructive to add to that.
Well, I think, one of the things I mentioned at the top of this show is all of us here tonight are sitting here offering our opinions from our backgrounds. We are all human beings within our profession. But I think by having these conversations and sharing our views amongst each other and with the viewers, it brings an understanding. And that should be at the heart of, I think, where we're kind of moving forward. So let me move over to my audience questions. I have one from Michael Southerton. He says, President Obama appeared on a virtual town hall and urged lawmakers around the nation to adopt Campaign Zero's 8 Can't Wait police policies of police reform. Data shows that committing to these 8 action steps can decrease police violence by 72%. What steps are being taken to ensure that each of these measures are being implemented with fidelity within our county police departments? So can any of my guests talk about the 8 Can't Wait campaign? Christine?
I'll offer up something. We had spoken about this last week when we talked, and that was actually the first time that I had ever viewed that 8 Can't Wait thing. A lot of the things in the 8 Can't Wait are already in place. These are policies that a lot of our agencies have already adopted and put into place. So I think the key there is just ensuring that these things are happening and that the policies are being adhered to. As I recall, some of the 8 Can't Wait things were.
So let me tell you what they are so that we're all talking from the same place. There are 8 different tactics. Ban chokeholds and strangleholds. Require de-escalation. Require warning before shooting. Requires to exhaust all alternatives before shooting. Duty to intervene. Ban shooting at moving vehicles. Require use of force continuum, and require comprehensive reporting. So some of these things we've talked about. We've talked about comprehensive reporting to a little bit about our reforms. What about required de-escalation? I believe in your training, I've seen that you have de-escalation training already.
Yes, well, that's part of the use of force continuum. And we are trained in de-escalating situations. I mean, myself, I've been trained as a crisis negotiator, so I have extensive training in there, but we always try to de-escalate the situation verbally, and that's right in your use of force continuum. So it's there. So are people jumping that step unnecessarily? And the thing is, with the use of force continuum, you can jump steps. You may go from verbal to deadly force in a moment of seconds. And that's one of the things on the 8 Can't Wait, talked about a warning shot. That just doesn't make any kind of sense to me. That's not safe. We're not going to give somebody time that is getting ready to kill somebody or ourselves time to turn that gun on us or turn that gun on whoever was their original target. The prompt reporting and comprehensive reporting, that's all there. The use of force continuum, that's all there. So a lot of these things are already in place.
Representative Williams, I know you raised your hand.
Yeah, well, when you talk about the 8 Can't Wait, remember this was formed by Barack Obama in 2015, that's a part of a police task force, an advisory of sorts. So when you talk about a reduction in these violent encounters of 72%, that's significant. And while I think the implementation of these things have been slow and sometimes not as robust in terms of practice, I think it's good sense to begin more thoroughly, comprehensively inserting these policies. And I don't want to minimize that all of these come out of that local citizens advisory board, so that these are things that people across the spectrum of economics, races, and professionalism, these are people who have weighed in and suggested that these are action items that could really reduce significantly. And the empirical data seems to suggest they're right. 72% is a healthy reduction percentage. So that I think there's real value in working at establishing these protocols in all of our municipalities, counties, and larger cities.
Anyone else? Captain RHONE? I know you train in use of force. Have you had any, I mean, let's just be fair. I mean, have you had the chance and opportunity to look at the programs of 8 Can't Wait? Because I know until, last week I hadn't heard of the reform either. So do you have any comments on that?
I did not really deep dive into it. I saw it when you brought it to our attention. One of the things that I look at, and again, in an effort to not be redundant, is, de-escalation is already is already there. Use of force continuum in most of your agencies are there. So I really didn't see anything that was new. I think the issue is we have to do a better job at the implementation and the fidelity of those things, so to make sure that we don't get to this point. To Sergeant Cusick's point, seeing that they suggested warning shots, you know, the first question I had was, where's that round going? Whenever it makes its final destination, and there is accountability for that. So while I think on the surface, the majority of the things that they're discussing, we just maybe as the profession and organizational leadership need to do a better job at seeing those things through to fidelity.
Actually, Elena, one of our live audience members, actually just said, kind of mimicked exactly what you said. Even if new policies are put into place, the problem is accountability. Policies don't matter if officers aren't being held accountable. So how can we enforce that accountability?
Again, it comes down to the organizational leadership. You know, if a complaint comes into my office, which they have, I have a responsibility to investigate that complaint. And then if the officer violated a policy, a procedure, or unfortunately a law, then I also have a responsibility to deal with that officer, whether it's you know, a verbal reprimand, a verbal conversation, a written reprimand, a suspension, remedial training. Did you know, maybe this officer missed something along the way and just didn't know that they can't do what they did. So I need to look at that as a whole, and then I need to step back and say, okay, did the organization fail somewhere to make sure that this is understood? You know, oftentimes you come into an agency, and in your first couple of days of field training, you get handed a policy and procedure manual. And depending on your agency, that manual could be 100 pages. It could be 5,000 pages. I mean, it really depends. And, you know, you're signing that says you received this policy and procedure manual. But the question is, did you really read it? Do you actually know what your agency is telling you you can and cannot do and how to operate? And oftentimes that's really what you find is when an officer has done something that they should not have done, and you pull up that signed form that says you received your policy and procedure manual, and we actually change ours to say that you not only you received it, but you read and understand it, because that's the key. If they just received it, they throw them in the bottom of their locker. Sure, they have no idea what they're not allowed to do. So again, it's about the fidelity. You can have all the policy and procedures in the world you want, but if you don't hold people accountable to the things that they are not doing correctly, then we continue to see this vicious cycle. So we have to hold people accountable. And if they can't fix the behavior, then we need to move them along, because this is not the profession for them.
I'm surprised there's no standardization in training across the agencies. Am I just not a police officer, and I don't understand that?
I mean, there are standards that come, and I'll speak specifically to Pennsylvania. There are standards that you learned in the academy, right? There's ethics, there are things that come out, but every agency can up those standards to whatever level they see fit. And that's where you see some variances and changes.
Okay, and I have been corrected. My Google work was not as fast as it was. When I talked about warning shots, it was require a warning, so it wasn't necessarily fire a warning shot before. It was just a warning of some sort. So I wanted to stand corrected there. I have a question from Lucas. Can citizens bring forward laws to change the situation, or do we have to wait for election years for our local officials? Rep. Williams or District Attorney? How can the little people get involved in the making of the laws?
I think some of that is taking place now at the grassroots level. Some of what you would have seen take place today on the House floor is the result of little people. That differential I talked about, bottom up, not top down, saying these are the things we need to see happen in terms of legislation in our Commonwealth. And so I think when you look at the way laws are put together, people who do what I do listen to constituents who have concerns, ideas, and they bring those ideas to legislators, representatives, senators, and then those ideas are formed and they become laws, pieces of legislation. So I think that involvement at the grassroots level is key. And I think that's some of where we are as a nation even now. That's the way laws get created in our Commonwealth.
Yes, absolutely. So calls to your elected officials with ideas that they can bring forward is essentially the summation of that. Deb, do you have any further comments?
Only to reiterate what Steve Jarmon said earlier, which is it's so important to vote and make sure that you don't have to wait. You can now contact your local representatives, your senators, your state representatives, but you need to vote in or out of office who you think reflects you and your opinions and your values. And so show up, and that makes all the difference. We've seen that happen over the past few election cycles, and it's been really exciting because our voices matter and they can make a change.
Absolutely. Let me ask this question from Teresa. Is there any type of community evaluation process for officers, like a rating system based on quality of their work? Christine, Sergeant Cusick.
There's not like a standard across the board. However, many years ago, when community policing was the buzzword, I did actually work for an agency that would send out quality assurance surveys. And so they would send these surveys out to anybody that called for anything. And the community, whoever would call, would provide feedback. Not all agencies implemented that. I don't know if they are doing that now, but I actually don't think it was a bad idea. I don't think it's a bad idea now. I don't know why agencies wouldn't embrace that, especially during this time where we really do need to evaluate what our officers are doing, responding to any types of calls. I think it will be very beneficial.
Okay. One more question here from Antonio. He says, what does the police department feel is their relationship to the community, and what engagement is currently being made with low income and our minority members of our community? So for any of our officers or district attorney, if you have anything to answer that question from Antonio.
I'll jump in. I think the relationship again is one of that human aspect that I talked about before, right? That people really see the individual and the heart behind the uniform and the badge, and those, once we get to that level, those relationships will begin to foster, right? Because if somebody has an experience, they may say, hey, listen, I know the person you need to talk to. Go down there and ask for Sergeant CUSICK. She'll take care of you. She'll hear you out. She'll listen to you. And that's based off of relationship, an experience that somebody had with Sergeant CUSICK. And now that word of mouth, going out to 4, 5, 10 people. And now we start to do that. And again, from a supervision level, Sergeant CUSICK is modeling the behavior that she's expecting of her officers, her line officers. And so that starts to fall in line, because if either one of us were to go out and say, this is what I want you guys to do, but we don't model that, that's nothing more than lip service. And so we can't provide that lip service. We have to model that behavior and build that trust. And once we do that, I think you will see that community engagement of what's happening. And regardless of your neighborhood, regardless of whether you're in a row home or a 5,000 square foot single family home, you treat people as human beings, regardless of their social status.
That's good words and wise wisdom there. I have one last question from Anonymous, but I'm actually going to open up to all of you. So usually I do this one last thing, which is, if you forgot to say anything or you want to stress something, you can do that. But I think this question is a good one here from Anonymous. It says, a number of changes have occurred in the wake of the protests, new laws being considered, streets being renamed, surges in voter registration, and more. What do you think about these changes, and are we moving in the right direction? So I'm going to start with the district attorney. She's in my upper left corner. So what do you think about these changes, Deb, and are we moving in the right direction?
They are necessary and they're important, and it couldn't come at a more necessary time. Yes, I think having the dialogue even here tonight is one of the first steps that we're taking. Meeting with leadership and also with people in the community is a perfect step forward. But making sure we're respecting one another, listening to each other's voices, changing the laws, hiring the right people, vetting the people properly, and continuing our discourse on these important issues to address racial inequality and police brutality is something that we just can't stop doing something about. So yes, I think we are moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Representative Williams, what do you think? Are we making moves in the right direction? And what's your one last thing you'd like our community members to hear from you?
We've had starts before, and we're still having this conversation. We've had marches around police brutality that go back to the 1960s, and we're still having the dialogue. So obviously, I'm always a fan of incremental steps and hoping that things get better, and I remain hopeful. I remain hopeful because I think we're starting to see this as a global as well as a local human rights issue. And the fact that many of my white brothers and sisters have engaged in this in ways that maybe we have not seen in the past. And so I'm hopeful that, yes, we're in a good place. There's a kind of passion now that's been missing. And this recognition that if all lives really do matter, then certainly Black lives matter too. It's not that they matter more, but they do matter. And so I think that sort of assimilated voice from both Black, white, and Latino communities is resonating. My hope is that this will be different than some of the things we've done in the past.
Thank you for that comment. And I hope things are different from the past as well. Captain RHONE, what is your response to that question? And what's your one last thing you'd like our viewers to hear from you?
I think we are moving in a forward direction. I think that, as the saying, enough is enough. People are sick and tired of being sick and tired. And when you look at what has been happening across the world, right, not just across the nation, but across the world, you are looking at folks of all shades, color, backgrounds, understanding, education, and you're seeing a common theme, and I think that is really the start, right? Because if this was just African Americans pounding the pavements in the streets saying that, then I think that we would probably have not moved enough. But as Rep. Williams said, we are seeing all shades and all colors and all backgrounds driving this. And I think we are going to see that next big level up from progress that was made before. And what my final thought will be is to those listening this evening is don't give up hope on every police officer, because not every police officer is bad. Look at that individual for an individual in their heart. And if they are a bad police officer that shouldn't be in the profession, then use that same voice that we talk about voting and go to that leadership and speak out and get that police officer removed from your community so that we start to weed out those that don't belong among us.
Thank you, Captain RHONE. Mr. Jarmon, what do you think about our progress, and what's your one last thing for our community viewers here?
I do think that we're moving in the right direction. I think about my thoughts now, 2 weeks after George Floyd was killed. And I remember thinking at the time that there's outrage now, but nothing's really going to happen. It's going to be the same. There'll be protests and then we'll move on. But I've been really moved over the last couple of weeks because of the additional voices that joined in, that Representative Williams and Captain RHONE talked about. You know, there's always going to be the people that are aggrieved that are going to be speaking out. But as we've talked about, that's never enough. You know, as we saw with, you know, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, it was the images of not just them out protesting, but white people joining the fray. That sent a powerful message. So the most powerful message that I've seen since this happened was police joining the message or joining the conversation in ways that I've never seen before. I've had police officer friends reach out to me personally and say, "What can I do?" That's never happened before, you know? So that alone makes me think this is different and we can do something great from here. But I think the lesson is we can't ever assume that something's over. You know, we're almost 60 years, 3 years from now, it'll be 60 years since Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. And to see this past weekend, people marching for what appears to be similar things, I was happy to see new voices joining in, but it's also sad that it's necessary. So I think moving forward, we just have to listen. You know, we have to be vigilant and pay attention to when people are saying, when people are making grievances known. Listen to them, hear what they have to say, see if there's ways that we can resolve it before we get to a point where it's necessary to march or it's necessary to protest. I think too many times we get to a point where we say, "Oh, well, it's over. There's been progress. We don't have to do anything else." But I think it's an ongoing thing for as long as we live. I think we always have to be mindful of how other people are feeling, what other people may be going through, empathy. So that would be my closing.
Thank you, Mr. Jarmon, for those words. Sergeant CUSICK, you have the last word of the evening.
Can I just say ditto, 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 and ditto?
I mean, that's the quickest way to end the show, yeah.
I do feel like we are moving in a positive direction, and I feel like that is evidenced by a lot of the communication that has been done just in the past week or so since Mr. Floyd's death. And I have had very deep discussions with my law enforcement peers, as well as my friends in the African American community. I've tried to do a lot of self-reflection and just like Steve said, practice empathy in a way that I don't feel that you're empathetic when you put a but in there. And okay, I hear what you're saying, but this is what is happening to my group. And I would say to both groups, people in Black Lives Matter, people on the Thin Blue Line, try to avoid doing that, because when you do that and you put in that but or that contingency, it kind of discredits what that person's feeling. And so I guess I would encourage my brothers and sisters in law enforcement to really think about what their oath is moving forth. Know that we are not, we are the good guys, and there are so few bad apples out there, but we don't want them representing us. And I guess be mad at that group. Don't be mad at the groups, or don't feel offended by groups that are calling for reform. Be mad at that group that they put us in this position, that we have to defend ourselves. And to the people wanting reform, I would encourage them to, come to the police departments, meet your police officers, maybe even explore a path in policing, because we need those different faces. And that, I think that's kind of where I stand on it. I just feel like we are making moves. And if we continue to embrace each other, I'm hoping that we'll have great changes.
Thank you. I want to thank all of my guests. We've gone an hour and a half, and I know your time is valuable, and many of you are in Zooms day in and day out, and we have long days. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for your bravery and your opinions. I want to thank my law enforcement officers present and those in our viewing audience for all that you do. I want to thank my legislative members and our elected representatives like Deb and Representative Williams for everything that you do, and Steve for being a voice for your community, both in when it comes to elections as well as a prosecutor and defense attorney. So thank you for your time, and let's continue these conversations, but let's also keep our feet on the ground and keep everybody moving forward. So with that, you can all sign off for the evening. I do want to say thank you so much again for speaking openly and candidly. These are hard conversations for us to have, but highlighting a problem as massive as racism in America, particularly with the context of law enforcement, should make us uncomfortable and have those conversations and let that sink in. Like I said, once we have those conversations and listen, like Sergeant Cusick asked, we can move forward together to affect change. So thank you very much for being with us this evening. And you guys can sign off. With that, that is going to be our show for the evening. I do want to invite my listeners, goodbye everybody, as they all pop off on our screens here. I do want to invite my listeners, if you found any of this helpful this evening, then please go ahead and share it with your members of your community. This will be a video on demand. So as always, you can share this with your community members. We do expect to continue to have ongoing communications and discussions on race relations here at VOXIPOP. So please join us for future episodes. And I want to thank you again for being a part of this conversation this evening. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening.